Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co, and today I'm reviewing The Adventures of Dex Dixon, the board game. Dex Dixon is a 1 to 8 player, yes, you heard me right, a 1 to 8 player game of scenario-driven, adventures. Scenario-driven adventures in which you're going to be taking control of a variety of bosses in the game. You're going to have a bunch of bosses, yes, including Dex Dixon over here, plus a variety of others from both sides of the spectrum of good and evil, as you are either vampires or, well, a whole bunch of things. You're vampires, or you can go ahead and bite people. You're werewolves. You can go ahead and poison people. A whole bunch of things you can do in this game as you basically take on the side of good or evil, go through a bunch of potential scenarios. This is not a campaign game. This is a scenario-driven game. You'll pick a scenario, you'll go through that. There are solo scenarios, co-op scenarios, and then primarily the main focus is going to be head-to-head scenarios in which you and the players in the game go head-to-head, controlling a team of bosses as you attempt to accomplish your scenario goals. This is a prototype. Everything you see here over here, rules, components, all that stuff subject to change, and I'll have a link to the crowdfunding campaign down below. But the basic idea already, like I said, is scenario-driven combat in which you're going to have your adventure. You're going to have your boss. Let's go ahead and show you over here. You'll have your boss, and then you have a bunch of item decks which you can't see because they're all off to the side of the board over here. Right now I set up with a 2-board scenario. There are ways where you can go ahead, each side of the board represents the 2 sides over here, and you can have them combined in some scenarios, or just be dealing with one in others. But in the game, you're going to have your bosses, and your bosses throughout the course of the game will be acquiring powers. Powers that can either be one-time use, these are slippery powers. Alternatively, you have powers that are going to be sticky powers that stay in play in front of you. Your character can have 3 powers in front of you. They can also have an artifact in front of you. You can have an artifact as well. You can have a bunch of pieces of equipment you can have in the game, and then additionally an event. So you have a whole bunch of things going on for a variety of decks that you can use to build out your boss and the ways they are going to activate. All these decks are just different things that will help you in the game, giving you things that will affect the game state with events. So, artifacts you can use as much as possible. The powers that you can either have ongoing powers or pay into them using the mana system in the game to pay into them and activate them as needed. You'll pay to play them, and sometimes you can go ahead and just activate them. Other times you have to pay to activate them. Other times they're going to be situational. Other times they'll be one-time use. You'll have your equipment as well. Equipment that again sometimes will be slippery over here, being gone as soon as you use it, and sometimes there's sticky equipment. They're just various forms of doing different things that will modify your personal stats. Because in the game, aside from these powers over here, in the game, the core sequence of play is that on your turn, you're going to go ahead and roll 5 dice. You're going to roll these 5 dice, and then you're going to use the 5 dice to power up the things you do in the game. This is a bunch of things you can do. You can go ahead and move around the board once per turn. You can go ahead and attack once per turn per character over there, and you can also go ahead and then activate a bunch of different powers and abilities using your dice pool. Various powers and abilities will require you utilizing dice and using a certain quantity of dice as you're effectively one of the 2 currency systems in the game. You're going to have almost like a mana power, and then also your dice activations to activate dice in the game. But you've been using those to combine a bunch of dice. Let's say I'm going to use this 3, 2, and 2 to move 7 spaces in the game. And again, that's once per turn. You can go ahead and do that, moving your character and their standee around the board to potentially get closer to an opponent so you can possibly attack them, or alternatively to land on any one of the numerous spaces on the board where you can either gain power or recharge life points or draw from a variety of decks in the game as you power up your character as you play through this. So you're trying to be mindful of the board. You're trying to be mindful of the board positioning. You're trying to be mindful of a variety of different board locations that will have a bunch of interaction points, whether it's the troll bridge, whether it's the sewers which allow you to pop up between different locations, but also go to the other side of the board, and you have to have certain activations, both for the troll bridge and the sewers. You have to have certain opportunities or ways you can actually go ahead, whether it's items on the deck, whether it's abilities bestowed on you by other characters. There are ways to cross over into the other realms of the board as you go through this. But the general idea is you're moving, you're attacking, you're gathering things, you're powering up, and then you're activating various things that you've already put into play, all while trying to accomplish the objectives in the game. And the objectives is where the wide variety of stuff happens, because there's a bunch of scenarios you're going to be playing through over here, each of which give you different reasons to go for different things. There's going to be ways to actually achieve the objective, and there's also going to be a timer on the game. Effectively, certain times in the game, for instance, when you roll a 6, for example, there are going to be times where you go ahead and add various tokens to these center pools over here that effectively give a bit of a timer to the different sides of these tokens as different sides add them, giving you another way to keep the game flowing, to keep the game moving, to ensure that things don't get bogged down if the players aren't achieving their objectives as you go through them. If it's a little vague and ambient as far as the specific things you're trying to do, that's because it is very scenario driven. Whether you're attempting to do damage to other people, whether you're attempting to go to specific areas and gather the various artifacts that will be placed in the corner of the board, there's a bunch of scenarios you can go through that all give you something else that you're trying to do within the construct of, on your turn, you roll 5 dice, you use those 5 dice to drive your movement, your attacks, and the various powers you're going to be utilizing as you constantly try to power up your character, getting them cards that work within their system, within whatever strengths they have. Every character is going to have have health and modifiers and certain amounts of starting mana in the game, and ways you can modify their attacks, whether the ability to hit, ability to do damage, ways to modify their movement, and then special abilities at the same time. So everyone's coming into play with a healthy dose of powers and abilities and ways to enhance their gameplay as you drive towards those objectives, whatever they may be. That's basically what's going on in this game. There's a bunch of things I didn't really heavily get into. There's a bunch of modifier decks for, random location draws. There's a bunch of locations on the board that, depending on the scenario you're playing on, will have different reasons why you're doing one thing versus another. There's the idea of encountering. You're going to have your bosses. So you have the bosses, which are going to be the main thing you're controlling, but you also have the opportunity to hire. Let me see if I can go and grab these over here. You're going to have these cards over here. These mugs, effectively they're called, that you're going to recruit. So you have the opportunity to have a boss as well as a mug. Every player controlling a boss and a mug, or at lower player counts possibly controlling multiple bosses and therefore multiple mugs, as you basically control your team of characters to accomplish your goals more efficiently than your opponent does. And mugs are going to be less convoluted than bosses. You're not going to have the whole roster of powers and abilities and artifacts and equipment to power them up. They're basically another little guy to wander around the board and suit your actions, accomplish your actions in the game. And that's basically the core idea of what's going on in the Adventure of Dex Dixon, which brings me to the review, starting off with ease of play. The rulebook is not that hard to go through, with a caveat. The core gameplay loop of what's going on in Dex Dixon is you roll 5 dice, you assign them to various things, and you're powering up your character, and that's it. The core gameplay idea of what's happening is very crisp, very clean. There's a few small things you have to go through when you're attacking. You're going to be rolling first to see if you hit, and then rolling to see how much damage you deal. So there's a 2-step activation to attacking. Movement, you add your abilities. In all cases, you're always adding your abilities. So the core cycle is, for the most part, fairly simple. There's a bunch of small things that are nitpicky or unnecessarily complicated. Things like, the various troll bridge or the sewers, where there's multiple aspects of how you encounter with them, and you might have a card over here, but you might have somebody else bestowing that upon them. If you're a vampire, you can also bite someone instead of attacking them, and if you bite them 3 times, they'll effectively be turned into a vampire, effectively killing them as far as the game's concerned over there. There's going to be an entire aspect of 2 particular characters. Over here we have these 2 characters, the Kobold and Drasilia, which involve understanding entirely how the troll deck operates. A slight, not a big deal, but it's an additional page of rules just to play as these 2 characters that are different than the rest over there. There's a bunch of edge cases and aspects that tie into the accessibility of the game, and then part of what we'll get to in the review is you also have to learn the scenarios. This is not a game where you can simply learn the rules. You learn the rules, and then you immediately break those rules with whatever scenario you're learning that will teach you the things that are different. In this game, this is going to be different than that. In this game, you're going to be trying to do this. So you have the core rule set and then the scenario rules, which give it a drop of harder to jump into. I always find it's a bit harder to learn a game, and then before I have a time to internalize what I just learned, I have to immediately change the hypothetical knowledge that's in my head. It's the price you pay for scenario-driven games, but I think that's present in Dex Dixon. I think the core game has a lot going on, but it's mostly simple to understand, and then a bunch of things that kind of make it a little bit more convoluted. It's not that complicated, but a little complicated. As far as game time, it can depend on the scenario. It also could be depending on how you deal with these tokens over here, because you could modify how much are needed by more or less to make sure the game is longer or not as long, to modify that rule set around these general scenario goals. But generally, you're looking at anywhere between 60 to 90 minutes for most games. Could run a little longer, but generally in that range. As far as what I like, don't like, and can see others not liking, starting off with what I like, which to start with, there's just a ton of powers and abilities in this game. There's literally multiple decks. There's equipment and artifacts and events and powers. That's 5 different decks. Before we even get to the troll cards, there's 5 different decks of ways you can enhance the various abilities in play. You're going to have your core character with their own ability. You're constantly finding ways to try to build them out in ways that suit what they're already good at, while being mindful of, if at lower player counts you're controlling multiple bosses, or if you have mugs in play, you're trying to be mindful of all these different things going on as you build out your character, whether the one-time use abilities you're going to be using, alternatively the ongoing abilities that are going to be the sticky abilities that stick to your character and you have them in play. There's just a lot of ways to enhance what you are doing in this game. You start off with not a ton of stuff, but you're constantly making it so that you are better and better and doing more and feeling more powerful, and that's just fun. And there's lots of stuff to consider on your turn as you go through these scenarios over here. And again, scenarios are going to be different as far as what's going on. But whether you choose to attack the other characters, to get in the way, to try to accomplish your scenario objectives, to focus more on powering up, to gather the mugs or whatnot, there's a bunch of things you can try to do to suit your goals. And what you try to do and how you try to do it, it will very much depend on the scenarios, but there is a lot to consider. This, to a certain extent, is a roll and move game. Not really a roll and move, because you do have the dice allocation system, so it's not like you roll a dice, CFR, you move. Rather, you roll a bunch of dice and then assign them to various abilities to do what you need. But there's a degree of roll and move in this game, but there's a lot to consider as you go through that, as you try to figure out how to accomplish your scenario goals. And speaking of scenarios, there's a bunch of scenarios. There are a bunch of scenarios to constantly mix up what you're doing. This is not a game that you'll play it once or twice and then be bored of it. This is the game that you'll play the scenario, and then you immediately dive into the next scenario, which can be totally different as far as what it forces you to consider as you go through the game. There's a lot of variety built into the scenarios that keep it constantly fresh and interesting, although that does bring me to what I don't like, which is the scenarios have a lot of different rules. This is one of those things where it's inherently a thing I like and a thing I don't like. I like the fact that there's a wide degree of scenarios, and I like the fact that the scenarios feel meaningfully different. This is not a case where it's like, oh, scenario 1 is go to this location and pick that up, and scenario 2 is go to that location and pick it up. This is not that kind of situation. These are meaningfully different scenarios, but that also means meaningfully different in picking up the rules that are different scenario to scenario. This is a game where you'll learn the core rules, and you'll immediately break them scenario to scenario as you figure out which rules to kind of mentally remember. You're like, well, I did that scenario, and this scenario we're going to be changing that, and this scenario, those are going to be slightly different. So it's not incredibly difficult, but there is a page or two of rules for each scenario to go through, and that means that it's one of those things where you can play the same scenario you just played, and it'll be the same scenario, and you know how to play it, or if you want that different experience, you do have to learn new stuff and remember what stays scenario to scenario versus what changes. So it's both a thing I like and a thing I don't like in terms of the variety but accessibility of the game. In general, I mentioned this already in the accessibility aspect, but there are some rules that feel like it's a drop more than necessary. There are some rules that feel like it got a bit too fiddly. I feel there are ways to clean up the experience a bit, to keep the areas in which the rules enhance the gameplay, but possibly remove some areas in which the rules don't necessarily enhance the game that you're playing. I'm not a developer, I'm just saying aspects of the game felt like there were rules to remember that weren't that impactful and didn't enhance the gameplay experience. So for the most part, it's pretty easy to dive into, but some of those rules could be cleaned up to a degree. Additionally, I'd say in general, this does have to a certain extent the skirmish game aspect. Many skirmish games have this, and some do better, some not. But in Dex Dixon, you have to be next to somebody to attack them as you play through this game, which means that a lot of the game, you're wandering your little standee up to another standee, and then you're hitting them, and then you're going back and forth hitting them, either trying to run away, sometimes to add that distance, but very often it comes down to close the gap and hit people. That's something that is present in a lot of skirmish games, and it's not a mechanic I tend to love. I like skirmish games that don't necessarily make me feel like I'm constantly just trying to run, find you, and hit you. I want a bit more nuance in how that plays out, or other things to keep me interested. Games like Arena of the Contest, like Super Fantasy Brawl, they often give me a lot more to consider than simply moving up and hitting people. In Dex Dixon, killing people is not always the point, so in that case, it does sometimes give you reasons to do other things, and hitting people is sometimes just something that gets in the way. But when you are trying to hit people, it mostly comes down to close the gap and hit the other person better than they hit you with a bunch of dice checks, which isn't my go-to preferred way of skirmish games. And then lastly, I'll mention that I'm just not personally a fan of the theme as much. This is very much a noir-style game with a degree of, vampires and werewolves and a bunch of investigators trying to hold back the tide of darkness. It's a nice theme. It's not my personal jam as far as what it's doing. I'm not quite into the noir detective genre in general. As far as what I can see others not liking, first of all, a whole lot of dice rolling in this game. You're going to be rolling your hand dice to see what actions you can go ahead and get. And yes, you can have drastically different roles as far as how well rolling 5 dice works for you and what you can actually activate, how far you can move, and what you can do. So there's a lot of rolling and luck turn to turn. Additionally, that's going to be true of hitting as well. You roll to hit, you roll to see how much damage you're doing. There's a lot of luck baked into that. It does even out over the course of a game, but if you're not interested in having a bunch of rolls feel unfair, especially early game when you're building up your tableau more and more, and seeing someone possibly do better, it definitely has that in the game. Additionally, this is very much a team/2-player game, aside from the co-op and solo, which means if you're looking for more of a everyone controls everyone kind of experience, this is less of that. This is more team-focused. If you're not into team games, this is not quite as much your jam. And that's basically that. As far as final thoughts on the Adventures of Dex Dixon, there are aspects of this game that I really enjoyed and aspects of this game that are not quite as much for me. And the whole game actually falls into this very interesting genre, which in some aspects of the game, it feels more like an older school design, and in some aspects, it feels like it's more modern design. Different aspects are kind of combining over here. There's lots of cards and abilities and lots of decks over here that all give you a lot of things to actually build out your character in a way that feels meaningfully different. In addition to their starting differences that they have, there's also ways to just make them feel different as you add their powers and their equipment and their artifacts and events, and you put that all into play in a way that lets you feel like you're powering up. There's a lot of fun powers and abilities and skirmish aspects going on in the game. It also has some elements that I don't love in skirmish games, like the the constant and closing the distance and hitting each other close to face to face. And there's some aspects of the game that feel a little bit less polished. Overall, this one's a 3.5 out of 5 for me. I enjoy what it's going for. I enjoy what it's doing. It feels like an interesting mix between old school and new school in terms of what it's bringing, but it does ultimately give you a lot of fun powers and abilities and a lot of scenarios to keep the game interesting as you go through it. As far as other game recommendations, first of all, if you're looking for something that kind of leans into the constant roll checks you have over here with less going on than gives you a very RPG adventure theme, I recommend Talisman. Talisman from Final Fantasy games, from Final Fantasy Flight Games. Geez, Talisman Fantasy Flight Games is one that's going to give you a lot of dice checks and a lot of upgrading stuff and a lot of the things that are happening in this game, but with a cleaner rule set and just a lot less interesting stuff going on. This does have more agency and more choice though, so there is that. And if you're looking for the other end of the spectrum, if you're looking for something that'll give you a whole lot more to consider, I recommend Arena the Contest. It's going to be a lot going on, but if you want that skirmish game with powers and abilities and teams of characters that you combine to be able to take down your opponents, Arena the Contest, specifically the head-to-head mode, although you can also do it co-op and solo, will definitely enhance what you're getting out of Dex Dixon, taken to the extra extreme. So we have Talisman on one side, Dex Dixon, and Arena the Contest in terms of just how much decision space and complexity there are in these different games. In any case, and until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. Hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, I hope you have a good one.